The grand ballroom of the Crimson Palace sparkled under the light of 1,000 candles, casting dancing shadows across the marble floors where the most powerful vampires in the realm had gathered. Tonight was different from the usual court gatherings. Tonight marked the engagement celebration of Lord Damien Blackthorne, the vampire monarch who had ruled the Dark Kingdom for over 3 centuries, and his chosen bride, Isabella Ravencrest. Isabella stood at the center of attention, her pale skin glowing like moonlight against her blood-red gown that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. Her raven-black hair was adorned with diamonds that caught the flickering candlelight, and her crimson lips curved into a smile that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. She was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, mesmerizing yet terrifying. The vampire court moved around her like planets orbiting the sun, each member desperate to gain her favor or at least avoid her wrath. Isabella had quickly earned a reputation that preceded her wherever she went. She was known for her cruelty toward those she considered beneath her station, which included nearly everyone except Lord Damien himself. "More wine!" Isabella commanded, snapping her jeweled fingers at a passing servant without even looking in their direction. The young vampire, barely a century old, scrambled to refill her crystal goblet with the finest blood wine from the royal cellars. Marcus Chen had been working in the Crimson Palace for only 6 months, having been turned into a vampire after a tragic accident that claimed his mortal life. Unlike the aristocratic vampires who filled the ballroom, Marcus came from humble beginnings. In his human life, he had worked as a waiter in a small restaurant, supporting his elderly mother and younger sister. Even in death, he maintained the work ethic and dignity that had defined his mortal existence. As Marcus approached with the wine bottle, his hands steady despite the intimidating atmosphere, Isabella suddenly turned toward him with a look of disgust. "What is that smell?" she said loudly, her voice carrying across the nearby conversations and causing several heads to turn. Marcus paused, confused. As vampires, they had heightened senses, but he had bathed and dressed carefully in the uniform provided by the palace staff. "I beg your pardon, my lady?" Isabella's eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down like he was something unpleasant she had stepped in. "That smell of poverty, of common blood, it's revolting. How dare you approach me reeking of your peasant origins?" The conversations around them began to die down as more vampires turned to watch the spectacle. Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but he maintained his composure. "I apologize if I have offended you, Lady Isabella. I shall withdraw immediately." "Oh, no," Isabella said, raising her voice even louder so that now half the ballroom was watching. "I think everyone should see what kind of servants Lord Damien allows in his palace. Look at this creature, probably turned from some street rat who died in a gutter somewhere." Lord Damien, who had been engaged in conversation with several high-ranking vampire lords across the room, glanced over at the commotion but made no move to intervene. His dark eyes observed the scene with detached interest, as if watching a mildly entertaining play. Isabella stepped closer to Marcus, her voice dripping with venom. "Tell me, little servant, what were you in your pathetic human life? A beggar? A criminal? Surely nothing of consequence, or you wouldn't be here serving your betters." Marcus straightened his shoulders, his voice quiet but clear. "I was a waiter, my lady. I worked to support my family." Isabella threw back her head and laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "A waiter? How perfectly common. And now you're still a waiter, except you'll be one for eternity. How deliciously pathetic." Several of the aristocratic vampires around them chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join in Isabella's mockery or remain silent. The tension in the air grew thick as Marcus stood there, the wine bottle still in his hands, his dignity under assault in front of the most powerful vampires in the kingdom. Lady Vivian Montague, an ancient vampire with silver hair who had served at court for nearly as long as Lord Damien had ruled, watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. She had seen Isabella's cruelty before, but never so publicly displayed. The young woman seemed to take pleasure in humiliating those she perceived as weaker, and tonight she was putting on quite a performance. Perhaps Lady Vivian said softly, trying to redirect the conversation. "We should focus on the celebration at hand." Isabella whirled around to face her, eyes flashing dangerously. "Are you suggesting I should ignore the fact that this palace is crawling with inferior creatures? That we should simply accept the degradation of our noble society?" The ballroom had grown almost completely quiet now, with only the soft crackling of candles and the distant sound of music from the orchestra providing any noise. Even Lord Damien had turned his full attention to the scene. Though his expression remained unreadable, Marcus felt every eye in the room upon him. He could see the mixture of pity, embarrassment, and fear in the faces of the other servants who lined the walls. He could sense the discomfort of some of the nobles who seemed troubled by Isabella's behavior but lacked the courage to speak against the future queen of their realm.
Isabella wasn't finished.
She grabbed the wine bottle from Marcus's hands and held it up for everyone to see. "This wine is worth more than this creature's entire worthless existence. Watch this." Without warning, she poured the expensive blood wine over Marcus's head, the deep red liquid staining his white servant's uniform and dripping onto the pristine marble floor. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom as the precious wine, aged for decades in the royal cellars, splashed across Marcus's face and shoulders. "There," Isabella said with satisfaction. "Now you look as worthless on the outside as you are on the inside." Marcus stood perfectly still, the wine dripping from his dark hair down his face. His hands remained at his sides, his expression calm despite the humiliation. He made no move to wipe away the liquid or to flee from the room, though every instinct probably screamed at him to do so. The silence that followed was deafening. Not a single vampire in that grand ballroom dared to speak, to challenge Isabella's actions, or to come to Marcus's defense. They all stood frozen, witnessing the complete degradation of another being, yet none possessed the courage to intervene. Lord Damien finally stepped forward, but instead of reprimanding his fiancée, he simply looked at Marcus with mild annoyance. "Clean yourself up," he said in a voice that carried no emotion, "and have someone mop this floor immediately." Isabella smiled triumphantly, clearly pleased with both her actions and her fiancé's response. She had proven her power, demonstrated her cruelty, and shown everyone in attendance that she could do whatever she pleased without consequence. As Marcus finally moved to leave the ballroom, his wet footsteps echoing on the marble, Isabella called out one final taunt. "Perhaps next time you'll remember your place, little servant. The gutter is where creatures like you belong, and no amount of vampire blood will ever change that." The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations resuming in hushed tones as the orchestra struck up a new piece of music. The evening continued as if nothing significant had happened, as if a person's dignity hadn't just been destroyed for sport in front of hundreds of witnesses. But Marcus Chen walked through those palace corridors with his head held high, the wine still dripping from his uniform, his mind already turning over what had just occurred. He had seen the fear in people's eyes, not fear of standing up to it. He had witnessed the complete moral cowardice of an entire room full of supposedly noble beings. And somewhere in that walk through the empty servants' quarters, as he finally allowed himself to clean the expensive wine from his face and hair, Marcus began to understand something important about courage, about dignity, and about the true nature of the vampires who ruled over them all. The night was far from over, and the consequences of Isabella's actions had only just begun to unfold. In the shadows of the Crimson Palace, change was stirring, and it would come from the most unexpected source. A quiet waiter who had been pushed too far and who would soon find the courage that an entire room of nobles had lacked. 3 weeks had passed since the engagement celebration, and the incident with Marcus Chen had become the subject of whispered conversations throughout the Crimson Palace. Some spoke of it with amusement, others with discomfort, but none dared discuss it openly where Isabella might overhear. Marcus had returned to his duties the following night as if nothing had happened, serving drinks and clearing tables with the same quiet efficiency he had always shown. But those who worked closely with him noticed subtle changes. There was a new intensity in his dark eyes, a thoughtfulness that hadn't been there before. He spoke less but listened more, observing the interactions between the aristocratic vampires with the careful attention of someone studying a complex puzzle. Isabella, meanwhile, had grown even more brazen in her treatment of the palace staff. Emboldened by the lack of consequences for her public humiliation of Marcus, she seemed to view the servants as her personal entertainment. She would demand impossible tasks, criticize their appearance, and find fault with everything they did. The other staff members had begun to avoid her whenever possible, scurrying away like mice when they heard her approaching footsteps. Elena Rodriguez, a vampire who had served as a maid in the palace for nearly 2 decades, had watched Isabella's behavior with growing disgust. Elena had been turned during the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, and in her long existence, she had never encountered someone quite like the future vampire queen. Unlike many of the aristocratic vampires who simply looked down on the servants with indifference, Isabella seemed to actively enjoy causing them pain and humiliation. "She's getting worse," Elena confided to Marcus one evening as they prepared the main dining hall for another elaborate court dinner. "Yesterday, she made poor Thomas polish the same mirror 17 times because she claimed she could still see fingerprints." The boy was in tears by the end of it. Marcus carefully arranged crystal glasses on the table, his movements precise and deliberate. "Fear makes people cruel," he said quietly. "She's afraid of something, so she takes it out on those who can't fight back." Elena looked at him with surprise. "Afraid? Isabella Ravencrest. She's about to become the most powerful woman in the vampire realm. What could she possibly be afraid of?" Marcus paused in his work, considering his words carefully. "Perhaps she's afraid that without Lord Damien's protection, she's really no different from us. Maybe she recognizes that the only thing separating her from serving tables is the accident of her birth into vampire nobility." Before Elena could respond, the sound of Isabella's sharp laughter echoed from the corridor outside, accompanied by the measured footsteps of Lord Damien. The 2 servants immediately returned to their tasks, but both had heard enough of the conversation drifting through the doorway to understand that Isabella was once again regaling her fiancé with stories of her latest entertainment at the servants' expense. "And then the pathetic creature actually tried to argue with me about the proper way to fold napkins," Isabella was saying as they entered the dining hall. "Can you imagine? As if a turned peasant would know anything about proper etiquette." And Lord Damien's response was a non-committal hum, but Isabella didn't seem to notice his lack of enthusiasm for her stories. She was too caught up in her own amusement to pay attention to his gradually cooling demeanor. Over the following days, Marcus began to notice something interesting. While the servants cowered in fear whenever Isabella approached, and the minor nobles scrambled to stay in her good graces, some of the more established members of the vampire court were beginning to show signs of disapproval. It was subtle. A slight frown here, a meaningful glance there, a conversation that stopped abruptly when Isabella entered a room. But it was definitely present. Lady Vivian Montague, in particular, seemed increasingly uncomfortable with Isabella's behavior. As one of the oldest and most respected members of the court, Lady Vivian's opinions carried significant weight, and Marcus had observed her having several quiet conversations with other senior vampires that seemed to center around concerns about Isabella's fitness to rule. The breaking point came during another grand dinner, this one held to celebrate the anniversary of Lord Damien's ascension to the throne. The entire vampire court was present, along with visiting dignitaries from neighboring supernatural realms. The dining hall glittered with gold and crystal, and the finest blood wines flowed freely as course after course of delicacies was presented to the assembled guests. Marcus was serving at the high table where Isabella sat at Lord Damien's right hand, radiating satisfaction as she presided over the celebration. She had chosen a gown of midnight blue adorned with sapphires that matched her cold eyes, and her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that showcased a tiara that had once belonged to a vampire queen from centuries past. As Marcus carefully placed a crystal goblet filled with a rare vintage beside Isabella's plate, she turned to him with that familiar look of disdain. You again, she said loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear. Tell me, little servant, are you capable of performing any task without contaminating it with your common touch? The conversations around the high table began to quiet as attention turned toward them. Marcus straightened but said nothing, having learned from his previous encounter that any response would only fuel Isabella's desire for confrontation. But Isabella wasn't satisfied with his silence. She picked up the goblet he had just placed and examined it critically. "Look at this," she announced to the table. "I can actually see smudges on the crystal where this creature's filthy hands have touched it. How am I supposed to drink from something that has been tainted by peasant fingers?" Lord Damien glanced at the goblet, which appeared perfectly clean to everyone else at the table, but said nothing. Several of the visiting dignitaries shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly disturbed by Isabella's behavior, but uncertain how to respond in such a delicate diplomatic situation. Isabella stood up dramatically, still holding the goblet. "This is exactly the kind of slovenly service that degrades our entire court. How can we maintain our reputation for excellence when we allow creatures like this to handle our finest possessions?" She gestured toward Marcus as if he were an insect that had crawled onto the dining table. "Look at him. You can see the common blood in his very posture, in the way he stands there like the worthless servant he is. No amount of vampire transformation can change the fundamental inferiority of his nature." The dining hall had grown almost completely silent now, with even the servants along the walls standing frozen in place. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how far Isabella would push this performance, and whether anyone would finally find the courage to intervene. Lady Vivian cleared her throat delicately. "Perhaps we might focus on the celebration." "No!" Isabella interrupted sharply. "I think it's time everyone understood the standards we expect in this court." She turned back to Marcus, her voice rising with each word. "You disgust me! Your very existence in this noble hall is an insult to every true vampire present tonight. You should be grateful that we allow vermin like you to serve us, instead of throwing you back into whatever gutter spawned you." The words hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on everyone present. Marcus stood perfectly still, his face expressionless, but those who looked closely could see the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was reaching the end of his patience. Isabella wasn't finished. She raised the crystal goblet above her head. "This is what I think of your service," she declared, and let the priceless crystal fall to the marble floor where it shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. The crash of breaking crystal seemed to break the spell that had held the entire room in frozen silence. Several people gasped, and a few of the visiting dignitaries exchanged shocked glances. Even Lord Damien looked up with what might have been surprise, though his expression remained carefully controlled. "Clean it up," Isabella commanded Marcus, pointing at the scattered crystal fragments. "On your hands and knees, like the dog you are." This time, the silence that followed was different. It was charged with tension, heavy with the weight of something about to break. Marcus looked down at the shattered crystal, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Isabella's triumphant gaze. For a moment, everyone in that grand dining hall held their breath, sensing that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the history of their court. The choice Marcus made in the next few seconds would determine not only his own fate, but would reveal the true character of everyone present. And in that moment, as Marcus Chen stood surrounded by the broken fragments of Isabella's cruelty, surrounded by the silent witnesses to her systematic destruction of human dignity, something fundamental shifted in the balance of power within the Crimson Palace. Marcus Chen looked down at the shattered crystals scattered across the marble floor, each fragment reflecting the candlelight like tiny stars fallen to earth. The silence in the grand dining hall was absolute. Even the orchestra in the balcony had stopped playing, sensing the gravity of the moment unfolding below. When Marcus raised his head, there was something different in his eyes. The quiet resignation that had characterized his previous encounters with Isabella was gone, replaced by a calm determination that seemed to radiate outward from his still form. He looked directly at Isabella, meeting her cold gaze with unwavering steadiness. "No," Marcus said simply. The single word fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock throughout the assembled crowd. Isabella blinked, clearly not believing what she had heard. "What did you say?" she demanded, her voice sharp with disbelief. Marcus straightened to his full height, his voice clear and carrying to every corner of the vast dining hall. "I said no. I will not crawl on the ground like a dog for your entertainment. I will not be your victim anymore." A collective gasp arose from the assembled vampires. Never in the 300-year history of Lord Damien's reign had a servant directly defied a member of the royal court, let alone the future queen herself. Isabella's face flushed with rage, her beautiful features twisting into something ugly and vicious. "How dare you!" she shrieked. "How dare you speak to me that way? I am Isabella Ravencrest, future queen of this realm, and you are nothing, less than nothing." Marcus nodded calmly. "You're right about one thing, Lady Isabella. You are Isabella Ravencrest, daughter of minor vampire nobility who gained her position through birth rather than merit. But you're wrong about something far more important. I am not nothing." He gestured toward the other servants lined against the walls, many of whom were staring at him with a mixture of terror and admiration. "None of us are nothing." Elena Rodriguez there was a nurse who saved countless lives during the influenza pandemic before she was turned. Thomas McKenna was a teacher who spent his human life educating children in poverty. Sarah Williams was a single mother who worked 3 jobs to feed her family. Isabella's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her fury so great that she seemed temporarily unable to speak. Lord Damien leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes focused intently on Marcus with what might have been the first genuine interest he had shown in anyone for decades. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We may serve wine and clean floors now, but we do so with dignity. We work honestly, we treat each other with respect, and we maintain our humanity even in undeath. Can you say the same, my lady?" "I'll have you destroyed," Isabella screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "I'll have you torn apart piece by piece for this insolence." Marcus smiled sadly. And there it is. When faced with the truth about your character, your first instinct is violence. Not reflection, not growth, not even a reasonable argument, just the desire to destroy what challenges you. He looked around the dining hall, making eye contact with as many of the assembled nobles as possible. "You have all sat here tonight and watched this woman humiliate, degrade, and abuse those who cannot fight back. You have seen her cruelty, her pettiness, her complete lack of compassion for anyone she considers beneath her station." Lady Vivian Montague shifted in her seat, her ancient face troubled. Several of the visiting dignitaries were whispering among themselves, clearly disturbed by what they were witnessing. "And what have you done?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority that was utterly unexpected from someone in his position. "Nothing. You have all sat in comfortable silence while evil flourished in your midst, telling yourselves that it wasn't your concern, that it wasn't your place to intervene." Lord Damien finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You forget yourself, servant. You speak of things beyond your understanding." Marcus turned to face the vampire monarch directly, showing no fear despite the terrible power radiating from the ancient creature before him. "Do I, Lord Damien, is compassion beyond my understanding? Is basic human decency something only the nobility can comprehend? Is the difference between right and wrong too complex for someone of my humble origins?" The vampire lord's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You dare question my judgment, my choice of bride?" "I question the judgment of anyone who would elevate cruelty to the throne," Marcus replied without flinching. "I question the wisdom of making someone queen who takes pleasure in the pain of others, who sees kindness as weakness and dignity as something to be destroyed." Isabella had recovered enough to speak, though her voice shook with rage. "You pathetic creature! Do you think your little speech matters? Do you think anyone cares about the opinions of a turned peasant?" Marcus looked at her with something that might have been pity. I think, Lady Isabella, that your actions tonight have revealed more about your character than any words I could speak. You have shown everyone here exactly what kind of ruler you would become. He gestured toward the shattered crystal at his feet. This goblet was priceless, crafted by master artisans centuries ago, a work of art that had survived wars and revolutions. You destroyed it not because it was flawed, but because you could. Because destruction gave you pleasure. Because breaking beautiful things made you feel powerful. The truth of his words seemed to hit some of the assembled nobles like physical blows. They began looking at Isabella with new eyes, seeing past her beauty and noble bearing to the petty cruelty that lay beneath. Marcus wasn't finished. But here's what you don't understand, my lady. True power doesn't come from the ability to destroy. It comes from the choice to build, to protect, to lift others up, rather than tear them down. A real queen would have seen a servant struggling and offered guidance. A real leader would have used this moment to demonstrate grace, compassion, wisdom. Isabella's face had gone pale, her earlier rage giving way to something that looked almost like fear. For the first time in her privileged existence, someone was holding up a mirror to her actions, and she didn't like what she saw reflected there. Instead, Marcus continued, you chose to humiliate me in front of the entire court. You chose cruelty over kindness, destruction over creation, fear over love. And in doing so, you have revealed that you are not fit to rule over anyone, let alone an entire realm of people who deserve better. The silence that followed was deafening. Not a single person in that grand dining hall moved or spoke. Even the servants seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Lord Damien rose slowly from his chair, his face an unreadable mask. For a moment it seemed as if he might strike Marcus down where he stood. The ancient vampire's power filled the air like electricity before a storm, making everyone present acutely aware of just how dangerous he truly was. But instead of violence, Lord Damien did something no one expected. He looked at Isabella, really looked at her. Perhaps for the first time since their engagement had been announced. He saw the ugly fury twisting her features, the petty cruelty in her eyes, the complete lack of remorse for her actions. Then he looked at Marcus, standing straight and proud despite facing certain death, having found the courage to speak truth to power when no one else would. The vampire lord's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his ancient eyes. Perhaps recognition. Perhaps respect. The engagement is ended, Lord Damien said quietly, his words carrying clearly through the silent hall. Isabella staggered as if she had been physically struck. What? No! You can't. I'm perfect for you. I'm everything a vampire queen should be. You are everything a vampire queen should never be, Lord Damien replied coldly. This servant has shown me more nobility in 5 minutes than you have demonstrated in months. He has shown courage, wisdom, and moral strength, while you have shown only cruelty and weakness. He turned to address the assembled court. Let it be known throughout the realm that Isabella Ravencrest is no longer welcome at this court. Her behavior tonight has proven her unworthy of the trust and respect of our people. Isabella let out a shriek of rage and despair, but even as she did, several of Lord Damien's guards stepped forward to escort her from the hall. Her protests and threats echoed off the marble walls as she was led away, but no one moved to help her. When the doors closed behind Isabella, Lord Damien turned back to Marcus. The servant still stood among the scattered fragments of crystal, his uniform stained but his dignity intact. You showed remarkable courage tonight, the vampire lord said. Perhaps too much for your own good. Marcus smiled slightly. Someone had to speak up, my lord. Evil flourishes when good people remain silent. Lord Damien studied him for a long moment. Indeed it does. Very well then, Marcus Chen. You have proven that noble blood is not required for noble actions. From this night forward, you shall serve as my personal advisor on matters concerning the welfare of our people, all our people, regardless of their station. A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled nobles, but no one dared object. Marcus bowed respectfully. "I am honored, Lord Damien. I promise to serve with the same honesty I showed tonight." As the evening continued and the court gradually returned to normal conversation, the story of what had happened began to spread throughout the Crimson Palace and beyond. Word traveled quickly of the servant who had faced down the future queen, who had spoken truth to power and changed the course of history. Elena Rodriguez and the other servants looked at Marcus with new respect, understanding that his courage had not only saved him, but had freed them all from Isabella's reign of terror. Lady Vivian Montague raised her glass in a subtle toast to the man who had done what an entire roomful of nobles had been too frightened to attempt. And in the days that followed, as Isabella's belongings were packed and she was banished from the realm, the vampire court slowly began to change. Lord Damien, perhaps inspired by Marcus's example, began paying more attention to the concerns of all his subjects, not just the aristocratic elite. Marcus continued to serve, but now he did so as both servant and counselor, bridge between the ruling class and those who labored in the shadows. His quiet dignity and moral courage had not only exposed the cruelty of those in power, but had shown everyone present what true nobility really looked like. The crystal goblet remained shattered on the floor for several days, left there by Lord Damien's orders as a reminder to all who entered the hall. It served as a symbol of what happened when beauty was destroyed by cruelty, but also as a testament to the fact that sometimes, from the fragments of what has been broken, something far more valuable can emerge. And in the end, the greatest shame had not fallen on the humble waiter who dared to speak truth to power, but on those who had possessed the power to act, yet lacked the courage to use it, until one quiet man showed them all what bravery truly meant.